The chandeliers rattled softly overhead as the gilded doors creaked open. Silence followed, long and deliberate, before the click of polished heels broke it. He entered like a monarch from a forgotten painting, clothed in brocade and arrogance, every inch of him shimmering gold. His steps echoed across the marble floor of the Hall of Treaties, a room not used in decades, not since the world pretended diplomacy was still a dance. They watched in the gallery above, a crowd of aides, envoys, and scribes with eyes sharp as razors. Some wore expressions of awe, others concealed contempt, but none dared speak. Not yet. He stopped beneath the chandelier and let the silence thicken. "The tariff comes," he announced, as though declaring war. And with it justice. A cough, dry and purposeful, came from the far side of the hall. A man stepped forward, far less adorned, his coat dull with use, the color of winter wheat. "Justice or vanity?" he asked. "Which name shall we write into the charter?" The gold-clad figure, President Chancellor Aloysius Tremaine, smiled without warmth. "Vanity," he said, "is the currency of the weak. Justice is a tariff on ambition." Behind him, H scribbled down every word. The man in the wheat-colored coat was Elijah Morrell, Trade Minister of the Free Belt. He had no love for spectacle. His hands were calloused from years spent in border towns, trading grain for circuit boards and fuel for promises. He had come to this council not to parley, but to stop what he believed to be a madness dressed in regalia. "This is not about fairness," Elijah said. "It's control. You want to throttle the lifeblood of the accord. Trade. You want to own the veins that feed the world." Tremaine's smile widened. Control is order. Order is survival. The ministers shifted in their seats. They had seen this script before, empires writing their own myths. But Tremaine was not like the emperors of history. He wore their costume, yes, but his vision was sharper, colder. He was a showman with a scalpel. "The tariffs will protect our laborers," he continued, turning now to the full assembly. "They will elevate the homeland, ensure that we are not left to wither under the shadow of cheap imports and foreign exploitation." "And what of our allies?" A voice called from the left, Honora Devick, delegate from the coastlands. Her voice, soft as wind chimes, carried farther than it should have. "Do they not also rely on our grain, our steel, our microgels? What happens to them when the tariff comes?" "They will adapt," Tremaine said flatly, "or they will perish." Gasps rose, not of outrage, but of recognition. He meant it, and worse, he believed it necessary. Elijah stepped forward. "This path leads to embargo, to retaliation, to a cascade we can't control. The world is not a stage for your pageant, Chancellor. This is not theater, it's fire." But Tremaine only tilted his head, considering. "No, Minister, it is theater, and fire makes the best finale." The chamber cracked then, not with flame, but laughter, dark and nervous. Ministers looking to each other, unsure whether to stand or to applaud. Tremaine relished the dissonance. "You don't see it yet," he said, voice lowering into intimacy. "But when the tariff comes, they will call it rebirth. They will thank us for the ruin." Elijah felt it then, the weight of inevitability. Tremaine had set the stage too well. He had fed the people a story, one where enemies lurk behind every crate, every shipment, every foreign label. And the people, hungry for purpose, had eaten it whole. Still, he could not yield. "Then let the world hear this," Elijah said, stepping into the light. "If the tariff comes, so too does resistance. Not from armies, but from hearts, from shopkeepers and machinists, from ports and towns you've never set foot in. They will not bleed for your spectacle." Tremaine didn't answer. He merely turned and began walking away, the gold of his coat catching every candle flame like a sun in motion. At the doors, he paused, just long enough to speak without turning. "They will bleed," he said, "and when they do, they will call it patriotism." The doors closed with a thud that echoed into the bones of the hall. Elijah stood in the center, the chandelier's light now dim above him. Around him, silence swelled once more. Somewhere outside, the cargo crane slowed. Somewhere already, the tariff was coming. In the days that followed the Chancellor's declaration, The markets faltered like a drunk reaching for the last rung of a ladder. Prices twisted upward. Ships lingered longer at ports, and cargo manifests arrived redacted, suspiciously lean. Newsrooms, previously numbed by cycles of scandal, seized on a new theater of conflict. Tariff Gate, they called it, too flippant for the gravity it carried. Yet, flippancy was the bomb of the day. Inside the Iron Bureau, a concrete monolith seated on the former Capitol grounds, Aloysius Tremaine stood before a projection of the world, fragmented into data and zones. Dots blinked, green for compliant, amber for defiant, red for unpredictable. The map was his chessboard, and he moved across it without touching a piece. Devick's coastland block has stalled all grain imports, reported Marlowe Crane, chief strategist, his voice smooth as lacquer. They're framing it as environmental concern, but it's retaliation, a slow bleed. Tremaine didn't blink. Then cut their sea routes by 80%. Claim contamination risk. Let the world know. Resistance has a price. Marlowe hesitated only a breath before typing the order. He had long since stopped looking for lines between loyalty and complicity. In a corner of the room, behind a fortress of files, Cassandra Vey listened quietly. She had served as Tremaine's economic advisor for 6 years, longer than most survived. A former economist turned reluctant politician. She bore the look of someone who had long ago traded sleep for insight. Cassandra's role was to forecast storms and suggest umbrellas. She had warned him of this one. Cutting sea routes might provoke military escort, she said flatly. The coastlands have naval strength and international sympathy. You're forcing escalation. I'm inviting clarity, Tremaine replied. Let them show their hand. Fear is currency. Let's spend it wisely. Cassandra wanted to say more, wanted to point to the 20-year treaties unraveling at their fingertips, but words now had half-lives. Reason was a language Tremaine only pretended to understand. Across the city, under weaker lights and staler air, Elijah Morrell entered a modest brick hall filled with noise. Not the din of policy, but of people, dock hands, machinists, former officials, young organizers. The place reeked of coffee, desperation, and hope. He took no podium. He simply stood, and the room leaned in. They're already shifting the ports, he said, redirecting cargo away from independent zones. This isn't about protecting labor. It's about creating dependence. If Tremaine chokes the world, he gets to decide who breathes. A young woman in a threadbare coat raised her hand. What do we do? If the terrorists cut us out, how do we survive? We build parallel. Elijah answered. We trade through channels they don't control. We strengthen what's left. We don't ask to be spared. We prove we can't be ignored. Murmurs of agreement passed like embers. But embers couldn't fuel an uprising alone. They needed fire. Later, as the hall emptied, Elijah sat alone on the stage's edge. Beside him, an old friend arrived, one not seen in public since the last trade tribunal. Marshal Ren Voss, retired from the Northern Sentinels. He wore no insignia, only the weight of his years. I've seen what comes when leaders turn policy into weapons, Aren said without greeting. It doesn't end with cargo inspections. It ends with blockades, with boots and burning convoys. I'm not arming a rebellion, Elijah said, almost tired. No, but someone will, Voss replied. And the minute they do, this stops being about tariffs. It becomes about power. Elijah looked up, the ache behind his eyes deepening. Then what's left for people like us? Truth, Voss said, if anyone still listens. Back in the bureau, Cassandra stood alone in her office, staring out across the city's trembling skyline. She thought of the report stacked on her desk, graphs bleeding red, forecasts curling like burned parchment. She thought of her father, a dock worker who once told her terrorists were like tides. Sometimes they brought what you needed, other times they took everything away. Tremaine had rewritten the tide. She turned away from the window, paced to her desk, and slid open the secure drawer. Inside lay a single file, unmarked but memorized. The networks Elijah had referenced weren't rumors. They were real. Shadow trade routes, alternative currencies, alliances bound not by ink but by survival. She hadn't told Tremaine. Not yet. As night drew its curtain across the city, the glow of the bureau dimmed to skeleton light. Tremaine sat in his personal chamber. Less office, more throne room, leafing through a worn book of war quotations. His mind was not on trade, but legacy. History didn't remember compromise. It remembered victors. He turned to the next page, lingered on a passage. The true power of war is not in destruction, but in reshaping the world that remains. He smiled. The tariff, he thought, wasn't a policy. It was a beginning, and out in the darkness, on every dock, in every warehouse, the world began to choose who to follow and who to resist. Rain fell like spilled ash across the port of Marin, soaking crates stamped with countries that no longer existed in trade agreements. Dock workers moved slower now, not from laziness, but caution, always watching for the drone patrols that buzz over their heads like metal insects. The tariff had arrived not as a single decree, but as a wave that eroded routines. And when routines broke, everything else cracked with them. Elijah Morrell stood under the rusted eaves of a decommissioned control tower, wrapped in a coat too thin for the wind. Around him, a half-circle of coordinators and civic leaders listened while trying not to flinch at every distant siren. The new levy on modular goods just tripled overnight, he said, holding up a torn manifest. That's surgical precision. They're targeting tools, things we use to make anything else. Someone spat on the ground. They don't want us trading. They want us crawling. They want us choosing between obedience and starvation, Elijah corrected, which is why we build faster than they can strip. A courier shoved through the door with urgency in his breath. They raided the junction in Westbury, he said. Seized everything. Food, supplies, even the comms rig. Elijah closed his eyes for just a second, not in surrender, but calibration. Start redirecting east, he said. We'll make a drop in Red Hollow by nightfall. No digital trails. No standard containers. The others moved, understanding that in this new economy, whispers move faster than currencies. In a conference room lined with gold trim and strategic silence, Chancellor Tremaine sat surrounded by maps pulsing with red zones. His advisors flanked him like statues. Marlowe Crane was reading from an intelligence brief. Shadow markets are consolidating. They're trading in encrypted currencies and moving through ancient rail. The blockade has slowed them, but not broken them. Tremaine leaned back, expression unreadable. Rats always learn new tunnels, but tunnels collapse. He tapped a folder. Accelerate inspections. Use auxiliary units if necessary. They're already stretched thin, Marlowe said. There's resistance at key checkpoints. Armed in some cases. And how many cameras caught them? Tremaine asked. Marlowe blinked. 2, maybe 3. Then edit the footage. Broadcast it. Frame them as traitors to stability. The order was executed without debate. In Tremaine's world, perception was heavier than fact. Cassandra Vey didn't speak during the meeting. She rarely did anymore. Not because she lacked opinions, but because she learned the futility of speaking truth into a void. Later, alone in the data archives, she opened a hidden file keyed only to her biometrics. There, in a blurred feed, she watched an interview stream from a warehouse deep in the Red Belt. Elijah Morrell, tired but fierce, was speaking into a makeshift camera. We don't reject structure, he said. We reject cruelty. We reject the idea that control is necessary for civilization. Trade doesn't belong to governments. It belongs to people. And we are taking it back. Cassandra stared at the screen long after it ended. His words were not just defiance. They were construction. He was building something she couldn't yet see. Or maybe she could, and that's what scared her. Far from Marin and the Bureau, in the upper quarters of the floating city-state of Varel, Honora Devick stood beneath the crystal lattice of her observatory, reading the latest data burst from her border stations. Tremaine's tariffs had hit her region harder than most. Grain prices had doubled. Medicine routes had vanished. But her people hadn't broken. They'd organized. The decision weighed heavily, but she had made it. She drafted a single-line message and sent it through a secure channel. Begin phase accord with Free Belt. Activate silent corridors. With that, She became the first sovereign to publicly defy Tremaine's regime. When word reached Elijah, it came wrapped in code, buried in the rhythmic knocks of supply crate. He read the decoded message with cautious joy. "It started," he whispered. He stood, gathered his coat, and addressed his growing council. "This isn't rebellion anymore. It's coalition." The moment changed nothing and everything. Outside, the rain hadn't stopped. The docks were still monitored. The tariff still burned. But somewhere in a corridor once empty, trade began again, quiet, unmarked, defiant. And in the shadows of a world forced to its knees, something ancient stirred. Not vengeance, not wrath. Hope. Cassandra Vey stood in the atrium of the Iron Bureau, staring up at the mural etched into its ceiling, a grand panorama of commerce and conquest, painted in tones that now felt like lies. The chandelier above her no longer glittered. One bulb flickered in slow protest. Outside, the streets murmured with unrest, but inside, the quiet was deeper than silence. She clutched the file to her chest. Thin, worn at the edges and damning. Tremaine's office was dark when she entered. He stood behind a glass wall, his reflection superimposed over the cityscape, like a ghost king. He didn't turn. "You've come to object again," he said, voice low, almost tired. "I've come to deliver facts," Cassandra replied. She laid the file on his desk. The new tariffs on digital components triggered a cascade. Entire assembly networks have collapsed. Medical shipments are stalled. 3 allied regions are formally withdrawing support. Tremaine turned then slowly, the gold embroidery on his jacket catching the lamplight. "Allies are temporary. Order is permanent." "Is that what you tell yourself?" she asked. "That this is order?" He studied her. "You've changed, Cassandra." "No," she said. "I've remembered." He took a slow step forward. "They'll come to see the necessity. History doesn't favor hesitation. History doesn't favor tyrants," she replied. "It buries them." Outside the city, Elijah Morrell stood at the edge of the old Marlin Railway, staring down the iron path stretching into the horizon. Beside him, Honora Devick adjusted the comms dial, her breath misting in the dawn air. "Silent corridors are holding," she said. "We've re-established connection to the southern ports. No surveillance, no interception." Elijah nodded. "The network's growing. Traders from the outer reaches are joining. They've even coined a term for it, the free current. It's catching on." He handed her a document, a joint agreement, and signed but pulsing with intent. It wasn't a treaty, not yet, but it was something more important. A beginning crafted by the unheard. Honora took it carefully. "This isn't just trade," she said. "It's narrative. We're rewriting the world." In response, Elijah only offered a quiet smile. He had spent months rallying the broken, building through scraps and silence. And now, for the first time, it didn't feel like a reaction. It felt like a movement. In the Bureau, Tremaine stood alone as reports flooded his desk. Protests erupting in northern precincts. Ports refusing inspection. Allies defecting in 2s and 3s. The tariff had come, but it had not brought obedience. He read the latest intelligence note. Subject Morrell has begun aligning neutral territories. Coalition appears to favor decentralized logistics, adaptive currencies, and peer-to-peer governance. Low traceability. High morale. The word stung more than he admitted. High morale. That was the one metric he couldn't quantify, couldn't tariff, couldn't kill. He reached for his glass of marrow wine, but paused. Instead, he crushed the file in his fist. In a small cabin beyond the city's border, Cassandra watched the news feeds flicker across her tablet. She had resigned 3 days earlier, leaving behind her title, her access, her silence. Now she sat beside an old radio transmitter, headphones on, fingers poised above the key. She had joined the free current, not as an advisor, but as a voice. Her first message was simple. We are not enemies of the state. We are the architects of its correction. Across market to megacities, villages and vaults, her message bloomed. It skipped through satellites, tunneled through forgotten cables, echoed in repurposed speakers. And where it landed, people listened. In the Bureau, Tremaine watched the final feed. It showed a child barefoot, smiling, handing a crate of grain to a stranger across a border fence. No guards, no officials, just need and kindness. He turned away. He had built a world on control, and it was being undone by grace. In the Free Belt, as the sun broke through the old freight towers, Elijah stood beneath a flag not of a nation, but of an idea. Silver lines on black, symbolizing flow without border. Around him, thousands gathered, traders, healers, builders, once scattered fragments now fused by purpose. He didn't speak to them like a leader. He spoke to them like a peer. They tried to make us afraid of one another, he said. They tried to tell us that only control could keep us alive. But we remembered something older than power. We remembered trade, not as transaction, but as trust. The tariff came, but so did we. And they roared, not in defiance, but in unity. The curtain had fallen, but the stage was still theirs.